Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, you can put those in the chat, and those will be addressed after the presentation. And also, if you have not yet muted or turned off your audio, now would be a good time to do that as well. So let me get to the introduction of our speaker tonight. Scott Weidensaul is the author of nearly 30 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist Living on the Wind and his New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing. His latest book, Return of the Oystercatcher, coming in April of this year, showcases what's working for bird conservation around the world. Scott is a contributing editor for Audubon Magazine, a columnist for Birdwatchers Digest, and writes for a variety of other publications, including Living Bird. He's a fellow of the American Ornithological Society and an active field researcher, studying saw-whet owl migration for 30 years, as well as winter hummingbirds in the east, bird migration in Alaska, and the winter movements of snowy owls through Project SNOWstorm, which he co-founded. So without further ado, let us welcome Scott Weidensaul.
Well, thank you very much, Vince.
You're
Appreciate it.
welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate everybody coming out this evening. It's wonderful to see 77 folks on the roster here. Give me just a moment, and we'll do the screen share shuffle here, as we're all used to doing with Zoom these days. Vince, give me a thumbs up if you've got the title slide. Okay, thank you very much. Well, Vince mentioned Project Snowstorm, and that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. It seems to be an especially good winter to be talking about snowy owls, and particularly snowy owls in your neck of the woods, because I know that's not something that happens with the same regularity. A lot of winters that snowy owls appearing along the coast. I'm over in southeastern New Hampshire, along the coast of New Hampshire and the Massachusetts coast. Um, so I've been involved with raptors for a long time. I grew up, as we were discussing before the meeting started, in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, very close to Hawk Mountain. I got my start in the late 1980s banding migrant hawks, not Swainson's hawks like this one. This is down on the coast, down in South Texas. Um, but if you'd asked me for a long time what my favorite bird was, I would have said the northern saw-whet owl. Because, I mean, look at that face. How can you not like that face? As Vince mentioned in the introduction, for more than 30 years, I've been overseeing three saw-whet owl banding stations in eastern Pennsylvania, where I lived for most of my life. Through an organization called the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art, we've banded about 14,000 saw-whet owls in the last 29 field seasons. But then I met a new owl. And I got to tell you, there is something absolutely charismatic and electric about a snowy owl. If you've seen a snowy owl, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They have a real presence about them. They're big, they're sexy. Look at those, I mean, those yellow eyes. Um, and most winters, there's a scattering of snowy owls around. This is an eBird map showing the distribution of snowy owls in January of 2013. And this is kind of a typical distribution of snowy owls in a typical winter in the Northeast and the Great Lakes. You know, some birds as far south as Long Island, up along the coast of New England, up into Maine, through the St. Lawrence and Ottawa River valleys in southern Canada, and all along the Great Lakes. That was January 2013. This was December 2013, and I'm sure there are many people on the meeting this evening, on the Zoom this evening, that remember that winter. This was the biggest invasion of snowy owls since at least the winter of 1926, 1927, and possibly as far back as the 1890s. There were thousands and thousands of snowy owls that came pouring down out of Canada that year in such numbers that it was hard to turn on the television or open up a newspaper or magazine without there seeing something about snowy owls. And the story went something like this, that in the far north, up in the Arctic, the population of lemmings on which these owls depended had collapsed. And these owls were starving, and they were forced south by hunger to wander this unfamiliar alien southern landscape where sadly most of them were probably going to die. And pretty much everything about that story is wrong. It is not privation that drives these huge eruptions of snowy owls coming south, and certainly not what drove that mega eruption in the winter of 2013 and 2014. It's plenty. This is a photograph of a snowy owl nest in the Ungava Peninsula in northern Quebec earlier that summer, in June of 2013. There are four snowy owl eggs and one snowy owl chick surrounded by, and feel free to count, 78 dead lemmings and voles. This is one enthusiastic male snowy owl. But what he's basically telling his mate here is, baby, don't stop at five. Keep them coming. Um, Snowy owls are facultative layers. They can, if conditions are great, they can continue to lay egg after egg after egg in a large clutch of eggs. And that summer, lemming populations in the Ungava Peninsula of northern Quebec were at historic levels, and snowy owls, and we don't know how they do this. Snowy owls somehow seem to sense where the lemming populations are at their peak and will often gather there in large numbers. And that's what happened that summer in the Ungava Peninsula. You had snowy owl nests with 7, 8, 9 eggs in those nests, clutches of 9 birds, almost all of which survived because there was so much food available to them. And that winter, all those young owls headed south in this massive invasion. As they came south, we had no idea what was coming. The first inclination that there was something going on came in around Thanksgiving of 2013, November of 2013, when birders in southeastern Newfoundland reported seeing as many as 300 snowy owls gathered at places like Cape Race at the southeasternmost point of Newfoundland. And in fact, many of those snowy owls probably flew out into the Atlantic Ocean on their attempt to migrate even farther south. When they started pouring into the United States, I got a call from my good friend Dave Brinker, shown here. Dave is a biologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I've been working with Dave for decades on saw-whet owl research and other owl research. And he said, listen, none of us are going to live long enough to see something like this again. This is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We should try to get as much information out of this, as much data on these snowy owls as we possibly can. Now, our idea was maybe we can mobilize other raptor banders to get out there and trap and band as many snowy owls as possible, because a remarkably small number of snowy owls have ever been banded over the course of the last half century or so. About 2 hours after I got a call from Dave, I got a call from a former research technician of mine, a fellow named Andy McGann, who was working for an organization called Cellular Tracking Technologies, at the time based in Western Pennsylvania. They've since moved down to Cape May, New Jersey. And Andy said, hey, listen, we've got these transmitters here that we were making for another client to put on eagles, but if you can just cover our costs, we would love to get these on snowy owls. Well, you can't just decide to go out and start slapping transmitters on birds. You need permission to do that. And even those of us with um, federal and state banding permits that allow us to trap and band snowy owls did not have the authorization to put transmitters on them. You need a proposal. And so we reached out to Mr. Snowy Owl, Massachusetts' own Norman Smith at Mass Audubon, who of course has been working with snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston since 1981, longer than pretty much anybody else in North America. And we got in touch with Mike Lanzone, the guy that runs Cellular Tracking Technologies. And over the course of a couple of weeks, we pulled together a proposal to send to the U.S., the Federal Bird Banding Lab, asking for permission to put GPS GSM transmitters that CTT was making on snowy owls to learn more about their winter movement ecology. Because ironically, we knew less at that time about the ecology of snowy owls in the winter when they're down here on these more southerly grounds with us than we do about their behavior and their ecology on their Arctic breeding grounds. Don't let anybody tell you the government can't move fast when it wants to. Within an hour of submitting this proposal, we had approval from the banding lab, because it turns out they were already thinking along the same lines and hoping that somebody would come to them with an offer to do exactly what we did. And so Project SNOWstorm was born. And the capital SNOW there many of you will recognize that that is the four-letter banding code for snowy owl. SN for snowy, OW for owl. Um, Project Snowstorm. And Project Snowstorm has, in the years since then, grown into arguably the largest snowy owl research project in the world. As of last winter, we've tagged 115 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces using these GPS GSM transmitters. That's kind of the sexy part of what we do. That's the aspect of Project Snowstorm's operation that most people are familiar with, because watching where these birds are going, following their movements, has been incredibly impactful and insightful. But there's a lot more to Project Snowstorm than just that. If we're going to the trouble of catching these birds, we want to get as much data from them as possible. So our volunteer banders, and as you'll hear me repeat often this evening, everybody involved with Project Snowstorm is a volunteer. Nobody gets paid a dime for any of this. Our volunteer trappers and banders and taggers are also collecting blood and feather and DNA samples so that we can do isotopic and genetic and toxicology analysis on that. We also have a team of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists that we've been working with from the very beginning, who necropsy as many dead salvaged snowy owls as state and federal and provincial wildlife officials can provide for us, wildlife rehabilitators, birds that come in that either don't make it or have to be euthanized. We now have the largest data set on snowy owl health in the world. And we still have a core team of about 24 people or so. And as I said, everybody you see on this list, whether they do this as independent researchers or as part of a larger organization like Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, or agencies like Maryland DNR, University of Pennsylvania, Maryland Zoo. Some folks are able to do this through their job, but nobody involved with Project Snowstorm is making any money from this. But you need money to do research. And when we launched Project Snowstorm in the winter of 2013, December of 2013 is when we got this whole thing started, we didn't have a budget. And the way you normally do science is you come up with a proposal, you send that proposal out to agencies or foundations, and they often reject you, and then you revise your proposal and you send it out, and finally somebody takes pity on you and gives you funding for that. We jumped in with both feet. The very first transmitters that we were able to deploy were funded by a couple of anonymous private donors who gave us, well, the transmitters at the time were about $3,000 a piece. We got funding for 6 transmitters from these very generous folks. And we got going. And that was a point where Dave Brinker, who is a man of many ideas, said, we ought to try crowdfunding. And I will confess that I thought that was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. I said, so let me get this straight. You think we should ask people to give us money to play with owls? Because that's what it's going to sound like to a lot of people. I said, yeah, we should give that a try. So against my better judgment, we launched a crowdfunding campaign on the platform Indiegogo and set what I thought was an insanely optimistic goal of $15,000. And as you can see, that first winter, we blew right through that. We raised more than $36,000 in small tax-deductible contributions from around the country, around the world, actually, and a roughly equal amount of money from organizations like the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology, the Delmarva Ornithological Society, state agencies, the Natural History Foundation for Wisconsin, basically to underwrite the deployment of transmitters on snowy owls in their state or their region. And so that first winter, we were able to deploy 22 transmitters on snowy owls and create a website that allowed people to track and follow these snowy owls in almost real time. We'll get into a little bit more about that in a minute. But I want to talk first about the transmitters that we're using. So we still have a strong partnership with CTT in New Jersey, and they make these 30-gram transmitters that are solar powered. These transmitters are operating off 2 technologies that most of you have in your pocket right now. They're connecting with the GPS satellite system overhead and recording latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds if we set them up that way, although we usually do about one location about every hour to save power. And then a couple of times a week, they dial up through the GSM cell phone network and they send us all of that data cellularly. I like to joke that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And all that data comes into us. But of course, in order to do that, you first have to catch the snowy owl. And young snowy owls on their first migration south can be extremely naive around people. But we tend not to want to trap and tag juvenile snowy owls. That first winter we did because that's almost entirely what was down here. But juvenile birds do not have a high survival rate. And if we're going to be putting very expensive transmitters on these birds, we would prefer to target the birds with a proven survival track record. So we usually go for adult owls. And adult snowy owls can be very wary and can be very cagey, especially if they've been caught once or twice before, which is often the case near airports where the airport biologists try to trap them and move them away from the airports. Once we've got the owl in hand, we put a USGS leg band on the bird. We take all the standard morphometrics that banders do with any bird. And then it takes usually about 45 minutes or so to fit the bird with the transmitter. The harness goes around the wings. The transmitter sits in the middle of the bird's back. When we started this, well, there's been multiple learning curves. Let me put it this way. Um, we knew going into this that snowy owls, despite their reputation, are primarily nocturnal in the wintertime. Yes, they sit out in the open. Yes, they sometimes fly around in the daytime, although more often than not, that's because they're getting bumped by people that are getting too close. But they are, for the most part, nocturnal. However, they do roost out in the open. So we thought, okay, perfect application for solar-powered technology. What we didn't appreciate is that snowy owls are often like little sunflowers. They sit facing the sun, and as the sun moves across the sky, they face the sun. So their back is always in shadow, and they often have a tendency to roost up against objects, stone walls, fences, farm equipment, driftwood on beaches, something that will give them some protection because they are actually, if there are eagles around, eagles scare the willies out of snowy owls. That's one species that they are quite concerned and worried about. I think it's fair to say that every owl, starting with the very first one, a bird that we nicknamed Assateague, that was trapped and tagged on Assateague Island on the eastern shore, on the Delmarva Peninsula in Maryland. Pretty much every snowy owl has surprised us in some way. I mean, after all, everybody knows that snowy owls mostly eat small mammals like lemmings. So how many small mammals do you think this bird is catching at night out over the open water of Delaware Bay? Because he moved up around the bay and spent most of the rest of the winter on the New Jersey side of the Delaware Bay. This snowy owl was primarily hunting water birds out over the bay at night. Um, and you're going to see a couple of different kinds of maps. This particular style of map, anything that you see in red is a daytime location or movement. Anything you see in blue is a nighttime movement or location. As you can see, these birds are mostly nocturnal. But the reason I'm bringing this map up is this is that same bird. This is Assateague later in the winter out on Barnegat Bay. Now, that was a very cold winter. And that was January 2014 was the year of the polar vortex. And that eventually froze. But at this time, that was still open water. And so I was really surprised, wondering what on earth he was sitting on out there in the middle of the bay. But if you keep zooming in, underneath all those points is a channel marker. And so he would fly out there from whatever little island he'd spent the day on, snoozing away, and land on the channel marker and go, let's see, last night I had a bufflehead. Maybe tonight I'll have a scaup. These owls are individuals. That's one of the things that has really been driven home to us. This is a juvenile female that was caught that first winter down again, on Assateague Island on the coast of Maryland. And after she was released, she flew, as you can see, north up through Delaware, cut up through the Delaware Bay, crossed over through Pennsylvania, went kind of skirted Philadelphia, wise bird, headed west into Lancaster County, where there were a lot of snowy owls wintering that winter. She didn't stick around. She flew back down to the coast and spent the rest of the winter down around Cape May Courthouse. On the other hand, these are the tracks of two adult female snowy owls on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan a couple of years later. Each of those blobs is about a quarter of a mile wide. These two birds basically didn't budge all winter. And they also almost never trespassed on each other. In fact, the red bird only flew through the yellowbird's territory after the yellowbird had gone north for the season in the springtime. But you know, if your neighbor weighs 6 pounds, has an irascible temper, and 8 needle-sharp talons at the end of her feet, and she ain't afraid to use them, maybe you don't trespass. This is a bird, this is a young male that was caught that first winter at the Martin State Airport just outside of Baltimore. And um, as we'll talk about in a little while here, snowy owls love airports, and it's not really going to be a surprise to, I think, most of the people on this meeting this evening. We did not have a transmitter that was the right size for this owl. Male snowy owls, like most raptors, are smaller than the females, so we have two different size transmitters. So this bird was banded and transported west about 50 miles into the farmland of western Maryland and released. But he came back to the airport, the same airport, the next winter and was captured again. And so this time we were able to put a transmitter on him, move him down to the coast and release him down there. And he moved north, crossed Delaware Bay, moved up along the coast of New Jersey, spent most of the rest of the winter up around Great Egg Harbor, um, along the New Jersey coast there. He was kind of a surf and turf guy. Some of his hunting was done out over open water for water birds. Some of his hunting was done on ground. We've got some pictures that a good friend of ours took of him sitting on top of a dead cottontail rabbit that he caught. Um, and then come springtime, he headed north and headed up through New York City. And I mean, he went through the middle of Manhattan Island. In fact, at 2 o'clock in the morning, stopped on top of this 58-story skyscraper next to Madison Square Garden. That was the view he had up there before he decided he didn't really like the city and kept moving north up to Lake Ontario. Um, so Project Snowstorm, this is our 13th season of operation this year. We just launched back in November. And you can find out what's going on at Project Snowstorm at our website, which is projectsnowstorm.org, all one word. There's blog posts on there, there's interactive maps. All of the snowy owls that we have tracked over the years, all of their tracking data is available. You can sign up for our email alerts every time. At this time of the year, I'm mostly doing blog posts about every week or so. It's been a bit slow lately, to be quite honest with you, but hoping things will pick up. There's just been another big influx of adult owls coming south in the last couple of days into places like southern Ontario. And all of the tracking data for all of our owls is available on our website. You can find out where these owls have been. This is an adult male that we nicknamed Otter that has been traveling up and down through the Arctic. And the format of these maps is going to be changing in the relatively near future because this is kind of a legacy server that CTT has been operating for us for a while. But all of the same data will be available on the new modem. But you can click on any of these points and find out the date. You know, in this particular case, the bird was flying at about 33 miles an hour. Its latitude, longitude, all that good information is there. The one thing we won't tell you is where the owl is right now. All of our tracking data is time delayed by at least 24 hours because we want to make sure that we're not subjecting that owl to untoward human attention. And this has happened once or twice, if we've had an owl in a place that was getting too much attention, too many birders, too many photographers, too many people getting too close and harassing them, we will remove that owl's map from our website so that nobody knows where that owl is except us. Because the last thing we want to do is put these owls at any risk. Sometimes you get a map that makes you scratch your head. And this was one of them. This was a juvenile male from that very first winter, bird that we tagged in Erie, Pennsylvania, that moved out onto Lake Erie and with another juvenile male spent weeks and weeks and weeks out in what was an almost entirely frozen Lake Erie. Now, these little icons, the square icons, represent stationary points. And these were at roughly half-hour intervals. So this is a bird that was moving at about a quarter of a mile an hour. And I confess, when I first saw this, my first thought was, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. Because that's what it looks like. And then a day or two later, after looking at some satellite pictures and thinking about it a little bit more, realized, no, this is what happens when you have an owl sitting on a really enormous slab of ice that is very slowly being pushed by prevailing winds from the southwest to the northeast. That winter, Lake Erie was 98.5% frozen. But that means that 1.5% of it was open water. And when you looked day after day at the satellite images posted on the NOAA website, you could see how these enormous slabs of ice were cracking apart and opening and pushing and being pushed, in some cases being pushed to the north by south winds, in some cases being pushed to the south by prevailing north winds. And it explained for us what these birds were eating out there because we thought, 6 weeks out in the middle of this frozen lake, there's no mice out there, there's no voles out there. What they're doing is they're feeding on water birds in those open expanses of ice. And what's really cool about this is that we know from tracking data that one of our snowstorm team members, JF Therian at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, did for his PhD up in the Arctic, that some adult snowy owls spend the winter out on Arctic sea ice, where you have these permanent openings in the ice called polynyas, in which we now know winter large numbers of sea ducks and alcids like murres, especially thick-billed murres. And so you have these owls in the perpetual darkness of the Arctic winter feeding on these seabirds and these polynyas, and these young owls coming south in their first migration are in some respects practicing that lifestyle in the somewhat more forgiving environment of the frozen Great Lakes. So you have some owls like those two that are in really remote places, miles and miles and miles from the nearest human being. And then you have other owls like this one that spend the winter in some of the most densely populated urban environments in the East. This was an adult female that was trapped at that same small airport outside of Baltimore. We nicknamed it Monocacy. We name all of our owls for either the location where they're trapped or the location where they're released. We do not give owls human names. And this owl was trapped, fitted with a transmitter, moved west into the safe farmland of Western Maryland, and she came back to the heart of Baltimore. And it was cool in a sense. It was also a little bit heart-stopping because there's a lot of dangers for a snowy owl in an urban environment, and we really had to hold our breath about this bird. But it was also pretty cool to use like the Street View version of a feature on Google Earth to zoom in and see like kind of what this owl was seeing as it was roosting on one of its favorite spots on the roof of this particular church. I would not have wanted to be a free-running house cat in that neighborhood that winter. That would have been taking your life in your own hands. Snowy owls, when they come south, face a lot of dangers. And some of those dangers are natural. As I said, that first winter, all of the owls that we tagged were juvenile birds. This was one of them. This was a bird that Norman Smith moved from Logan Airport, moved this bird down onto Cape Cod and released it near Duxbury, if I remember correctly. But it didn't like Duxbury, and it flew out from there. I guess it was near Falmouth, forgive me. Flew from Falmouth out to Martha's Vineyard and spent the winter out in the vineyard, which is a rather tony place to spend the winter, except that in March of 2014, an enormous nor'easter came roaring up the East Coast with hurricane force winds. And just after daybreak, that young owl tried to fly across the harbor in the vineyard and did not make it. We don't know if the wind forced her into the water or if she got caught by a wave, but she drowned there. Another one of our tagged owls drowned in Gloucester Harbor under similar circumstances. And Norman was aware of at least 3 other unbanded, untagged snowy owls that also washed up, drowned and dead as a result of that same storm. All of them young birds. I have to think that an older, more experienced adult probably would have known enough to find a quiet spot in the lee of a jetty or something like that and just kind of ride out the storm. But the biggest dangers facing snowy owls when they come south are us, quite frankly. Snowy owls are famous for their attraction to airports. Airports are often in urban areas or in wooded areas, the only open treeless expanse of habitat that kind of looks a little bit like the Arctic to them. And people often ask, like, well, aren't they afraid of planes? Well, To a snowy owl coming from the Arctic, a tree is as alien to them as a plane. And so, no, they're not afraid of planes at all. They learn very quickly just that the planes stay on the tarmac. And as long as they stay away from the planes, they're safe. The problem is they don't always stay away from the planes. And I had a real gut punch lesson in this. The very first snowy owl that I put a transmitter on for Project Snowstorm was this juvenile male that I trapped at the Philadelphia International Airport with the help of USDA wildlife biologist Jenny Martin there, who was in charge of trying to keep birds and planes separated at that airport. We trapped him. We nicknamed him Philly. We put a transmitter on him. With the help of the Pennsylvania Game Commission, we moved him 50 miles west into Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and the little bugger went right back to the airport. Within 48 hours, he was back at the airport. And Jenny and I tried repeatedly to retrap him and move him away. I mentioned before that these birds are very individualistic. You know, the Philadelphia airport, if you've never flown in or out of there, it sits right on the Delaware River. And the Delaware River in the wintertime is full of water birds. And yet this owl never hunted out over the river. He did all of his hunting in the median strips and margins of I-95, which you want to talk about giving me a heart attack. Every time he flew out to that insanely busy highway, I had to hold my breath at night watching his tracking data. I guess I should have been worried about other things because one morning, just at daybreak, he flew across an active runway and was struck and killed by a cargo jet that was taking off. It broke every bone in his body. It didn't break the transmitter. The transmitter kept working. The really good news is it didn't bring down the jet. So one of the things that we have tried to do with Project Snowstorm from the beginning is figure out better ways to keep airplanes and owls apart. And so over the course of the last 13 seasons, we've cooperated with 13 airports in the US and Canada, and the folks that often trap and relocate the owls. These are paid biologists, paid contractors, paid to trap and relocate owls and other raptors from these airports to get transmitters on them to learn more about their post-release behavior, to figure out, are there ways that we can relocate owls in terms of the distance we take them, in terms of the length of time they're held before they're released, that will minimize the chances of them coming back to the airport. So over the course of those years at 13 airports, 42 tagged snowy owls were part of this data set. And it turns out, yeah, there are some commonalities here. Not surprisingly, the farther you move them from the airport, the better. Also, if you hold them for at least 48 hours before you release them, feed them something, give them some mice while you're holding them, that reduces the chances of them coming back. And so a couple of years ago, we summarized all of this information and published this in the Journal of Wildlife Management as sort of a best practices approach for airports to try to minimize the danger both to owls and airplanes from airplane collisions. That paper is one of about a dozen peer-reviewed scientific papers that we've published based on Project Snowstorm data. Some of it based entirely on our data. In other cases, cooperation from members of the International Snowy Owl Working Group, of which we've part. The most recent and probably the most important paper that we published is this one. It's a status assessment and conservation priorities for snowy owls. This is the first time that there's been a global status assessment on the population and population trends for snowy owls. And I have to tell you, the news is not good. One of the things that primary author Rebecca McCabe and all of her co-authors found is that snowy owl numbers have declined about 30% in the last 33 years, over the course of the last 3 snowy owl generations. We also know that there are far fewer snowy owls than we thought even just a few years ago. And I want to be very careful here because I don't want to suggest that the numbers I'm telling you are going to indicate a massive decline. But for many, many years, folks in the snowy owl community assumed that estimated there were about 300,000 snowy owls worldwide. And that number, snowy owls nest at the very highest latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, in the Arctic and the subarctic, in places where there are relatively few people and very, very few people interested in counting snowy owls. And so that 300,000 bird estimate was a matter of just basically adding up the maximum number of snowy owls that had nested over the course of time in their entire circumpolar range, from Alaska all the way around the northern hemisphere to the Russian Far East. What folks did not know in those days was that snowy owls are highly nomadic. Not so much from winter to winter. They can actually be very faithful to their wintering locations, but from summer to summer. Because after all, these are birds that are dependent on population peaks in small mammals like lemmings, which happen about every 4 years or so in any given place. Which means that if you go back to the same place this year where you nested last year, there's probably not going to be any food. So snowy owls in some case will move thousands of kilometers from one breeding season to the next. And you can see that with our tracking data. Our snowy owls may be in the Ungava Peninsula of northern Quebec one year, and the next year they can be 2,700 miles away in the far extent of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. What that means is that for many, many years, scientists were double or triple or quadruple counting snowy owls. The global population of snowy owls is probably averages between about 14,000 and 28,000 adult breeding age snowy owls. So an order of magnitude fewer snowy owls than we thought for many years. Now, that does not mean the population's dropped from 300,000 down to roughly 30,000. It's just that we've been overestimating them. But the point is, snowy owls are far less common than we thought, which means that every one that we lose when they come south is a significant loss to the population, which brings us back to our veterinary team. There are three key vets here are from left to right, Dr. Cindy Driscoll, who has recently retired as the state wildlife veterinarian in the state of Maryland for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Dr. Cheryl Davison in the middle from University of Pennsylvania's New Bolton Center in southeastern Pennsylvania, and Dr. Erica Miller on the right, who is now the team leader. She is a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the most respected wildlife veterinarians in the country, long history with wildlife rehab. And that very first snowy owl that I lost at the Philadelphia airport was also the very first snowy owl that this team necropsied. And they realized when they started doing a literature search how little information was available about the health of snowy owls when they come south. I mean, there's this old myth that these snowy owls, as I said before, the belief that these owls are starving. One of the very first papers we published was an analysis of the physical condition of these birds that were being necropsied. Most of them are plump and fat and healthy, right up until the time they got hit by a car or electrocuted or flew into a window or whatever happened to the bird. These folks, again, all volunteers, nobody's getting paid for this. They get together a couple of times a year and necropsy as many snowy owls as we have specimens for. As I said before, we have been cooperating for years with state and provincial and federal wildlife agencies to collect and salvage snowy owls, wildlife rehabilitators, folks shipping us snowy owls from all around the country. For the most part, the Canadian snowy owls are necropsied in Canada because trying to get those things across national borders gets complicated. But they're all, our Canadian colleagues are taking the same data. And then they're taking tissue samples and sending those off to labs for parasitology and toxicology and histology analysis. And some of the things we found have been disturbing. For example, one of the surprises that we found was the degree to which snowy owls are showing evidence of methylmercury poisoning. Of course, methylmercury is an air pollutant that's generated by coal-fired power plants, tailpipe exhaust, all sorts of nasty things. Precipitates out into aquatic systems, into the water, and then starts to work its way up through aquatic food chains, bioaccumulating at higher and higher levels in, for example, fish-eating ducks like mergansers and loons. Loons aren't ducks, I realize that, but in fish-eating birds. And so snowy owls, particularly along the coasts that are feeding on those kind of top order piscivores are picking up, in some cases, significant amounts of methylmercury. Another real problem that we've been seeing, and this is it seems to be a rapidly increasing problem, is the degree to which snowy owls are being exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides. When we started Project Snowstorm, we started doing these necropsies back, 12, 13 years ago. The percentage of owls that we tested, well, let me just say, virtually every owl we test has detectable rodenticides in its system. But the percentage of birds that had what we considered to be dangerous to lethal levels of rodenticide was very, very low. By 2022, which was because of avian influenza, the last year that we've been able to sample a large number of snowy owls, that percentage of owls that had dangerous levels of rodenticide had risen to about 56%. So more than half of them had dangerous levels of rodenticide in their system. And because we have a large data set for these birds, and I want to say here that there's nothing unique about snowy owls in this. As I'm sure many of you are aware, rodenticides are a problem for every single raptor out there. There's nothing unique about snowy owls in this. They are just serving kind of as a poster child for this. The Massachusetts Pesticide Review Board is considering new regulations to control the use of second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. And so, as part of their public comment period last autumn, Project Snowstorm submitted expert commentary on this. Many of the snowy owls in that sample that I'm quoting came from Massachusetts, and so it was something I think like about 38% of the snowy owls that we tested came from Massachusetts. So we had a pretty good sense of what's happening in Massachusetts with snowy owls. So, snowy owls start to head north in spring. Generally speaking, the young birds head north before the adults do. Excuse me, let me flip that back again. The adults head north before the juveniles do. They've got something to do. They've got places to go, people to meet, territories to set up. The young birds are in no particular hurry at all. They're often around until late April, sometimes into early May before they start wandering north again. The transmitters that we have, because they communicate through the cell phone network, once these birds get out of southern Canada and get beyond the cell phone network, we lose track of them. But their transmitters continue to gather data. That continues 24/7, 365 days a year. And then when the birds come south in subsequent winters, if they come south, because not every bird comes south every winter, we get all of that data and we can see where those birds have been over the course of the summer. If you put all of that data together for all of our snowy owls, this is what it looks like. And I should also say that all of our tracking data is archived at MoveBank, which is the largest archive of animal movement telemetry data in the world. And our data is available for other researchers to use. You'll notice there's some interesting patterns that show up here. One is that snowy owls, because they are open country birds, do not like flying through dense forest. And so they're usually taking the shortest route they possibly can. Those birds that are tagged here along the northeastern coast are often moving up through the St. Lawrence and Ottawa River valleys up to James Bay and Hudson Bay. Those from the western side of the Great Lakes will often fly considerably farther to the west in order to take advantage of this large area of open land in the Canadian prairies before they bolt across the Canadian boreal forest and get back up into the tundra. And if they don't, if they try to make that trip across the central part of the Canadian boreal forest, as you can see, they often don't make it. We've found that spring migration is by far the most dangerous time for these owls, especially for young owls on their first migration. I want to leave you with one last head scratcher of a movement that made us really wonder what we were seeing. This is one of those birds that spent the winter out on Lake Erie, that very first winter. And it migrated north in the spring and headed out to Hudson Bay and actually out onto Hudson Bay where it did that. And there was a lot of hemming and hawing among our team to try to make some sense of what this meant before we realized eventually this is what happens when you have a snowy owl riding on an ice floe. And assuming you can see my cursor down here at the bottom, When the tide and the wind are going in the same direction, the owl goes for a long direction and then a long way, and then the tide goes back against the wind, and then the tide and the wind are going in the same direction, and then it moves this way, and then the wind comes out of the south, and then the wind comes out of the west. And at that point, the owl says, "Oh, the heck with that," and flies back to land again. Um, if you are interested in what we're doing with Project Snowstorm, grab a screenshot right now on your computer with the address there, projectsnowstorm.org. Um, come visit us, see what we're doing. Um, we'll be tracking birds. We just had a really exciting thing happen a couple of weeks ago. A bird that we call Hokilaga that had been tagged at the Montreal airport and had been AWOL for the last about 18 or about the last 22 months, showed up again this winter and uploaded 21,000 data points showing where he'd been in all of his time wandering around up north, where he stayed for at least 2 winters. But he's back on the Montreal airport now, sending us regular data reports. We're expecting more of our tagged owls to come south. It's been an unusually slow year for our tagged owls. His Hokilaga is the only one that has transmitted. We know of another one of our snowy owls in southern Ontario that's now back on his traditional winter territory, but hasn't sent us any data yet. And my suspicion is that his name is Newton, and Newton probably stayed so far north so late in the winter that his transmitter ran out of juice and went into hibernation. But now that he's back down in southern Ontario, where it has not been very sunny lately, we're hoping that his transmitter starts building up enough of voltage and he can eventually send us all of his summer data to find out where these birds have been. Um, it's been a great opportunity to share this with you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to take a drink, and then I'm happy to answer as many questions as folks have. So I hope you've enjoyed that.
Here's my thing. Um, okay, let's see.
So Vince, how do you want to do the chat? Questions in the
Can
chat.
you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, well, I have a couple of questions right now in the chat. The first one is from Joseph. He has a question about one of the necropsy slides. He wanted to know about the owl's heart on the table, if that was the owl's heart on the table.
I'm not a wildlife veterinarian. It's what it looked like to me. They remove some of the organs. They do what is called a cosmetic postmortem because all
Uh-huh.
the snowy owl specimens that we get after the necropsy and after whatever tissues they need are removed, all those owl specimens go to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia to be made part of their permanent collection. As I said, we want to get as much use and benefit from these owls as possible. Um, the problem for us from a necropsy perspective, and this goes back to what Bill was talking about in the conservation report, is highly pathogenic avian influenza. That hit us like a truck the winter of 2022. And most of the snowy owls that have been salvaged in the Northeast over the last couple of winters have tested positive for highly pathogenic avian influenza and have had to be incinerated. We do our necropsies at the New Bolton. It's the Pennsylvania Animal Diagnostics Laboratory. It's the Department of Agriculture's laboratory. The last thing they want at a poultry laboratory is bringing avian influenza in. So we've had relatively few owls the last couple of winters that we have been able to necropsy. Now, so far this winter, um, it's been more of a mixed bag. There have been some snowy owls that have been picked up that were or came into rehab that had to be euthanized that did not test positive for avian influenza. We're hoping to be able to start to build up the data set on rodenticide because, as I said, that's something that we're very, very concerned about. But we're also very concerned about what population level impact avian influenza has had on snowy owls. Because as I said, there are not that many snowy owls in the world. We know that HPAI has had a real population level impact on bald eagles in places like the Southeast, on peregrine falcons in some parts of their North American range. Um, we used to get 9 or 10, on average, 9 or 10 or 11 of our previously tagged snowy owls coming back every winter. The winter after avian influenza hit, that dropped to 2. And we have to
Mm.
believe that at least some of those birds died from avian influenza. The birds that are especially that are wintering along the coast, they've got to be exposed to it on a frequent basis because they're picking off a lot of water birds, and it's primarily ducks and geese and gulls and other colonial flocking birds that are carrying this stuff. So, um, yeah. So I'm
Okay.
sorry, that's a long answer when you're rather than just getting to the heart
No,
of it,
that
so to
that
speak.
that was very good. So our next question says HBC, I guess Conservation Commission is working on MODIS towers
Mhm.
tracking and the site for a new tower in Western Mass, and they want to know how is MODIS involved.
So we're not using the MODIS technology at all for this. Although having said that, I'm very involved with MODIS. I'm part of the Northeast MODIS collaboration. We erected 163 MODIS receiver stations from basically Maryland and Delaware all the way up to Maine, including many in Massachusetts. But the transmitters we're using are working off a different technology. The MODIS transmitters are VHF radio. They're line of sight from receiver to receiver. Um, they would be absolutely useless for tracking snowy owl movements up in the Arctic, whereas the transmitters that we have are able to record GPS locations year round, and then, as I said, send them all back through the cell phone network. Um, there's no one best tracking technology. All of these tracking technologies are complementary in some way. Snowy owls are big birds. You can put a 30-gram transmitter in a snowy owl, and that's like less than 2% of the bird's body weight. If I put a 30-gram transmitter on a 30-gram Swainson's thrush, I get no migratory data at all. But you can put a half-gram MODIS transmitter on a Swainson's thrush and get great migration data. So all of these tracking technologies have their advantages and disadvantages, their pros and their cons.
Okay, our next question is from Martha, and she would like to know, can you tell us more about the interactions of the owls with eagles? Do eagles kill these owls?
They will if they can catch them. Absolutely, they will. And the snowy owls know that. Snowy owls, it's remarkable how much a snowy owl, you can read the body language on a snowy owl. If you know, there have been many times when I've been sitting, patiently waiting for a snowy owl to finally get interested in the trap that we have set out there for it. And you can just tell from the bird's body language, and it's cocking its head up, and it's like, okay, there's an eagle around somewhere. You start looking, you can see that with birds at your feeder. It's the same thing. It's just it's impressive to see a big, very capable predator like a snowy owl suddenly acting like a scared prey animal. And the only thing that I've ever seen cause that reaction in them are eagles. And I've only ever seen that with bald eagles. I'm sure they would react the same way with golden eagles, but usually the places where you see snowy owls, you're primarily going to be seeing bald eagles. I've never seen a bald eagle try to take a snowy owl, but I know people who have.
Hmm. Okay, next question is from Lee. How many total transmitters have been deployed since the beginning of Project SNOWstorm? Also, have the transmitters been streamlined by CTT to be smaller and lighter?
Yes, great questions. So we've deployed 115 transmitters, as I said at the beginning, in 17 states and provinces. And yes, we have worked closely with CTT to modify the weight. When we started out, the transmitters were around 45 grams or so, and we've been able to get that down to about 30 grams. We've made the transmitters narrower and higher because one of the things we found out is snowy owls like to preen feathers over the top of their transmitters. And that bird that is back and we're not getting data from, Newton, he's been doing that for years. He's just kind of a little pain in the butt that way. It interferes with the recharge and the transmitter. CTT's gotten much better. The technology is constantly evolving. And so, for example, the solar panels have become dramatically more efficient. One of the things that happened because of the pandemic and the breakdown in pandemic supply chains is that the solar panels that they were sourcing from overseas, and I honestly can't remember if they were getting them from India or China or where they were coming from. Um, they couldn't get the solar panels, so they started making them themselves, and they designed, as it turns out, much, much more efficient solar panels. We used to have what we call the Valley of Death, where in late January, early to mid-February, solar angle is very low, days are very short. These owls are often roosting in the ground, often in the shade, and their voltage would get lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, and then the transmitter would go into sleep mode for a while until we'd come out the other side of the Valley of Death. Then there'd be, the sun's getting higher in the days are getting longer in March, transmitter would come back to life. The last couple of winters, that has not been an issue. The transmitters have gotten much more efficient. There's some other bells and whistles in there. There's accelerometers in those transmitters. There are temperature sensors in those transmitters. So we can tell, for example, if the owl is not moving for any length of time because of the accelerometer, we can tell that there's a problem. One of the owls that we tagged last winter was a juvenile bird. We kind of broke protocol last winter because we had so few owls carrying transmitters and tagged a number of young birds. A bird that was nicknamed Jolene also broke protocol. The folks that tagged it named it for the recently deceased adult daughter of some folks they knew, which I said, you got to hope that owl makes it. And unfortunately, that owl did not make it. Anyway, we don't know what happened to her. Her transmitter went stationary up in the Bruce Peninsula between Lake Huron and the Georgian Bay. And we had a single GPS point for it. And Charlotte and Malcolm went in and looked and looked and looked. It was this incredibly dense spruce forest. They kind of bushwhacked around. They weren't able to find anything. Um, After the leaves dropped in November, this all happened back in April. After the leaves dropped in November of this past year, um, the transmitter got enough light to send us several hundred GPS locations that we were able to average out, and literally to the fraction of a meter knew where this bird was. And they were able to go back in and recover Jolene's transmitter, and not a whole lot left of Jolene at that point, unfortunately. So that was when we couldn't get necropsy. It might have been avian influenza. We're not really sure about that. Um, so yeah,
All
but
right.
we're constantly streamlining and reducing the size and weight and footprint of those transmitters.
Right. All right. Sally would like to know, why does keeping the owls for 48 hours reduce their tendency to return?
I don't know. I haven't been able to ask the owls. It seems to do so. It may just be that it reduces that connection they feel with the place where they've been. Um, we're really not sure about that. I'd love to know, man. There's so many. If I could ask a snowy owl a question, there are so many questions I would ask them, including how do you know where the lemmings are going to be?
Right.
Because they seem to be able to figure that out. Um, that's one of the big unanswered mysteries about snowies.
Okay. Jim would like to know, are the transmitters designed or planned to stay on the bird for its lifetime?
Yes, they are. And the transmitters continue to work for years and years and years and years and years. What we have found is that the telecommunications industry keeps upgrading from 2G to 3G to 5G to LTE, and it has tended to leave the transmitters behind. So the owl that I mentioned earlier that came back after being, kind of AWOL for 22 months has a 2G transmitter, and he's at the Montreal airport, and God bless Rogers Communication. Rogers still has at least one 2G tower somewhere in the Montreal metro area that this owl's transmitter is connecting with. But that's not going to last forever. And so if the folks at Montreal Airport from Falcon Environment, which is the contractors that trap and relocate birds at the airport, if they can trap Hochelaga for us this winter, Dr. Guy Fitzgerald, who runs the largest raptor rehab center in Quebec, who the person that puts transmitters on for us, he's going to swap out Hocheulaga's old transmitter and replace it with a new one. um, because the new transmitters, we're told, should be good for the foreseeable future. There's no expectation that the telecoms are going to make another massive redo and upgrade of, to a new platform that would leave these things behind. But yeah, there are snowy owls out there with transmitters on, unfortunately, that are no longer communicating with the cell phone network, which we find enormously frustrating. We have in the past spent a lot of time trying to retrap snowy owls with failed transmitters. Baltimore, that bird I mentioned that landed on top of the skyscraper in New York City, um, there was C no fault of CTTs. They tried to push through a software patch because, while they can send data to us, we can also send commands to the transmitters. And there was a glitch in the software patch, and it knocked Baltimore's transmitter out of commission. And we spent 2 winters going up to the same territory in the Ottawa River Valley where Baltimore was coming back every year to winter, before we were able to trap him. And unfortunately, at the time, we did not have permission from the Ontario Ministry of the Environment to replace his transmitter. So we took the transmitter off and released him without it because it was not doing him or us any good. And we felt an obligation to him. If we could possibly get that transmitter off him, we would. There was another owl that also had a failed transmitter that we tried and tried repeatedly to trap. But like I said, these adult owls, if they've been trapped once or twice, there's a lot of, fool me twice, shame on me. They become very, very cagey. Um, don't be fooled by how naive young snowy owls are and assume that that's the case for the adults. You don't get to be an old snowy owl by being dumb.
All right, Miles asks, I might have missed where you said you tagged your owls. Where are they tagged? Does anyone know where
Oh,
the owls we are seeing locally come from?
so we have no way of knowing where these owls are coming from. And in fact, we were not expecting there to be a decent flight of snowy owls this winter because we had no reports of significant numbers of breeding snowy owls in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic this summer. So we were surprised when all of a sudden a lot of snowy owls showed up in the Northeast and the Great Lakes. Um, we have tried and when I say tagging, I'm talking about putting a transmitter on. That's just slang for putting a transmitter on. Um, we have in the past tried putting very small, um, like 10-gram satellite transmitter, battery powered satellite transmitters on nestling snowy owls in the Arctic. This was something that we had planned to do in the summer of 2020 up on Bylot Island in the Canadian Arctic. Of course, the pandemic knocked that one into a cocked hat. Finally, in the summer of 2024, we were able to deploy 10 of them on Bylot Island. There weren't that many snowy owls breeding on Bylot that summer, but Laval University in Quebec has an ongoing research project on Bylot Island. JF Therian, who's on our team, is part of that. JF and his colleagues deployed those. None of those young snowy owls appeared to have survived the winter up there. They all tried to winter on Bylot Island, and it appears that none of them survived. That may be normal for snowy owls. We don't know. Their juvenile survival rate is one of the real unknowns about their ecology in terms of their full annual cycle. Um, it may be that the owls that we see down here are a fairly limited subset of the snowy owls the young snowy owls that are produced in the Arctic. Um, we just don't know. I am reasonably sure that the transmitters that we deployed on those young snowies were not implicated in their apparent deaths, because they were very, very small. They were like less than 1% of the bird's body weight, um, because we don't want to do anything that's going to harm these birds. Um, JF's feeling is that unless you have a really large prey base, many young snowy owls probably do not survive the first 3 to 6 months of independence. Once mom and dad aren't producing food for them, and also these snowy owls are often breeding in places where there has been a lemming boom, but that lemming boom is usually followed by a lemming bust. And so the small mammal populations that were producing lots of food during the summer tend to collapse as the year goes on. And as they move into winter, there may be very, very little food for them. So unless there's alternate prey supplies like Arctic hare or willow ptarmigan, it may be that their juvenile survival rate's very low, but we just don't know.
Hmm. Okay, another one. Don asks, are the falcons that hit the Polynias of the Bering Sea during deep winter in competition with snowy owls?
That's a good question. We don't know much about, well, I will say I don't think we know much of anything about the actual behavior of these birds. We know from tracking data that snowy owls move out into these polynyas in the wintertime. Um, and we've learned more recently that they're probably feeding on these sea ducks and alcids that also we didn't realize wintered there in large numbers. But there's nobody out on those polynyas in the wintertime watching what's going on. So interactions with gyrfalcons, we know gyrs winter out there as well, but
Hmm.
that would be, I would love to know that. And in fact, I've got a friend, Jeff Wells from National Audubon, who does a lot of work up in the boreal forest in the Arctic. And he hit me up the other day for like, what's your five biggest questions about Arctic wildlife? And I want to know how snowy owls know where the lemmings are. And a colleague of his is really interested in what's going on with gyrfalcons and snowy owls out on those polynyas. So I don't know if there's a research project cooking here. He didn't explain why he was asking this question, but um, yeah, if you've got super warm clothing and night vision goggles, because after all, it's dark, the sun doesn't rise for months at a time out there. If you're comfortable at 58 below zero, have I got a research project for you?
Okay. Carol comments that she saw a bald eagle at New Hampshire Airport where the Snowies have been visiting.
Mm. Yep,
So,
yep, yep. Well,
um,
I hope the snowies keep their heads down.
there you go. And Beth would like to know when the Snowies are feeding over the open waters for ducks, do they catch them like an eagle, grabbing them with their talons, or more like an osprey, actually diving into the water?
I have not seen them taking the ducks at night. My guess is that they're snatching. Snowy owls are much more falcon-like in their hunting behavior than, we think of owls, they're kind of like perch hunters and drop hunters, like wait until the prey goes below you and plop down on it. Norman Smith used to say that the only bird that a snowy owl couldn't catch was a peregrine falcon. And then he sent me a picture of a snowy owl with a peregrine falcon and said, I guess I was wrong. Um, it was a case where the snowy was sitting at Logan Airport. A young peregrine flew by chasing a shorebird. The snowy slipped in behind the peregrine. The peregrine picked off the shorebird, came down. The snowy owl came down and nailed the peregrine. And so it had, as Norman said, dinner and dessert. Um, they're sophisticated hunters. One of the snowy owls that I tagged in eastern Pennsylvania that first winter was a bird that was wintering in a Mennonite churchyard, roosting during the day next to the tombstones, and judging from the prey remains and the pellets we picked up, feeding mostly on robins, horned larks, snow buntings, um, all these field birds. Now, I don't know if they were picking them off at night when they were roosting on the ground. That would be my suspicion. But again, Norman has seen snowy owls taking, these agile flocking small birds from the air at Logan Airport. Snowy owls are remarkably adept, fast, agile hunters.
Okay, and another question from Donnie says, have you dumped your data set into AI software for analysis?
God, no, I'm not going anywhere near AI. What we have done is I mentioned that we have a lot of summer data. We've a lot of most of what we've well, pretty much everything that we've published at this point has dealt with the winter movement ecology of snowy owls because that's what we established Project SNOWstorm to study. But we've realized in the last couple of years that we have a really enormous data set of migration and summer data. And so this past year, in cooperation with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, We hired a young postdoc, a fellow named Diego Galago Garcia, he's Spanish by birth, living in Argentina, an absolute whiz at movement ecology analysis. And we asked him to take a deep dive into um, all of our tracking data and also tracking data that's being very generously supplied to us by our colleagues in Canada and even some colleagues from Norway who funded transmitters on snowy owls in the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta, and asked him to look for patterns in where these owls are going in the summertime, wondering whether there is some form of prospecting behavior going on where these snowy owls are maybe after the end of the breeding season, wandering around the Arctic looking for where there may be building populations of lemmings. And one of the things that Diego found in his preliminary analysis, and he's at this point, he's only done about 40 of the 80 or so owls in this data set, is that these owls have a tendency to return to the same general area about every 3.5 to 4 years, which is pretty much the periodicity of lemming cycles, small mammal cycles. So it seems like if they were lucky in an area this year, in about 4 years, they're kind of circle back through and see what's going on. And not every time is there enough food for them there to settle down and breed. But it looks like they may be moving back to those areas again and again. And one of the other things we came up with, or I shouldn't say we, because it was Diego doing this work, he was able to identify a number of areas in the central Canadian Arctic, in places like the Boothia Peninsula and King William Island, where snowy owls keep returning to year after year after year after year over the course of time. Now, again, not every year, but periodically and regularly. These areas appear to be unusually important for snowy owls. And once he's fully analyzed the full data set, we look forward to having a conversation with the Canadian Wildlife Service about whether those are areas that deserve particular attention. Snowy owls have just been uplisted in Canada. They're being considered, this is under what's called CASIWIC, which is kind of the Canadian version of the Endangered Species Act. They're being considered for a higher, more meaningful level of Canadian federal protection. We're hoping if that happens, that might give us a bit of an angle on dealing with the problem of baiting, which is a real problem on the Canadian side of the border. Commercial tour operators charging people thousands and thousands of dollars to take them out to photograph habituated snowy owls that have been trained to fly toward people to eat live mice that are being tossed to them. A really reprehensible thing to do to a wild owl, and a very dangerous thing to do to a wild owl. So yeah, we're hoping that this project of Diego's will have some conservation benefit to snowy owls, but we'll see.
All right. I think I'd like to wrap up now. We have several viewers: Charlotte, Carol, Olivia, Jennifer, and Ty, who would like to thank you personally for this great presentation, and I would like to add my thanks as well.
Well, thank you very much.
And also for your dedication to this project. It's a great project. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's my every once in a while, my wife will remind me, you don't get paid for any of this. That's fine. It keeps me out of trouble and gives me something to do during the winter time. Please, if you're at all interested, please go to projectsnowstorm.org, sign up for our email alerts. Um, come along with us. We are still entirely crowdfunded. We get no foundation support. We get no agency support. I should have mentioned this early on, and I didn't. But every year we run another crowdfunding campaign through the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in Eastern Pennsylvania, which is our 501c3 institutional home. So all the donations to Project Snowstorm are tax deductible. If you go to the Project Snowstorm website, there's information there. You can also read, I did a blog post just back 3 weeks ago, as I do every year. This is what we raised. This is what we spent to the penny. You can see exactly how the money is being used. We've got some new initiatives. I mentioned Diego's study. We are also partnering with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary and Albright University in Pennsylvania to develop what will eventually be a K through 12 set of snowy owl-based curricula using Project SNOWstorm data. Um, if anybody on this call is an educator and wants to use any of our tracking data for in-class projects, drop me a line. We're always happy to share that. We've had a bunch of really creative young science fair winners over the years that have used our data. We're happy to help. We wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for support from the public, and so we want to give back as much as we possibly can. So, all right. Well, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Great questions. And thank you for everything that the Allen Bird Club is doing for bird conservation in your part of Massachusetts.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Scott.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Night. Thank you.
Thank